Awesome. Well, thanks, Paul. And it's good to see everyone. I've worked closely with NIACS for many years. I've been at SFI for about a year and a half now, but previously I was at Michigan State University, which is part of NIACS. And in my role there as the director of the Forest Carbon and Climate Program, had tons of overlap with the NIACS team. So I'm based in Michigan, and I'm from Michigan. So I'm still in Michigan, even with the position shift. So it's nice to lots of overlap with you all. It was nice to see the list of folks, and I know we have a lot of probably intersecting connections and similar interests. Now at SFI, and I'll share a little more about this in my presentation. I have a look at the full North American footprint and how the standards are advanced and interpreted across the entire footprint, but still have an opportunity to work regionally and really nurture relationships and collaboration. So I'll get a little further into that, but it's really nice to be here with you today. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Lauren. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now, and hopefully it's the PowerPoint and not all the other browser windows I have open. My name's Paul Robitaille, and it's really great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I'm SFI's Senior Indigenous Relations Advisor, as Stephen mentioned. I've been with SFI for about 5.5 years now, and my role really is to oversee while working with a large team actually throughout the organization, SFI's Indigenous policies, programs, and partnerships right across North America. And I'm really pleased to be able to share a few of those today. Geographically, I'm situated in Huntsville, Ontario, Canada, a few hours north of Toronto. So I hope that you will excuse me if I speak Canadian through various portions of this. I'm doing my best to learn. But yeah, for fall, just to sort of end off there, my favorite part, like many of you, really is the harvest. The seasons very much are starting to change, so we're just in the midst of pulling things out of the garden, getting ready for the next garlic plant as well, and pretty soon we'll be getting out onto the land and water there to just enjoy all of the harvest that's available this time of year. So with that, I am, really excited to share a bit about the work that SFI does, specifically around in advancing Indigenous rights recognition and relationship building in and around the forest, including within the forest sector. That said, I do recognize that some of you might, not have too much experience with SFI or know too much about us. So with that, I did want to start just with the quick overview to situate ourselves here. SFI is a nonprofit organization. We're a 501c3 in the US, and we operate right across North America. While many people know us for this little label over my shoulder here and third-party forest certification, we really are diversified, and we advance a ton of different programs and services and collaborations that really are meant to advance a really broad vision. And that is a world that values and benefits from sustainably managed forests. And we realize that that is a very large issue and something that really no one or no single organization can do alone. So the way that we really seek to advance that is by focusing on collaboration. So as I'm going through here, and I know as Lauren will as well, hopefully that consistent thread you'll see throughout all of it is that all of these things point back to collaboration in one way, shape, or form, or they're meant to be a catalyst that can support greater collaboration in and around the forest on issues that a lot of different people and organizations care about. So again, one of the important ways that we can really advance these things that we're potentially or perhaps best known for, I would say, is our SFI third-party forest certification, our different standards, including our forest management standard. And it is a very large framework, all of which gets audited by qualified third-party auditors. But we're going to be diving into a couple of the different pieces in a bit more detail today. So, for my purposes, that important objective among the 17 is objective 8, and that is recognize and respect Indigenous peoples' rights. So we realize again, as a nonprofit organization, it's often I think a delicate sort of dance, right? And way that we need to sort of position ourselves and come to the table when it comes to Indigenous rights recognition and really advancing relationships. Rights and understandings of rights really can and should only be, decided and understood, in and between sovereign nations and governments. So what we really, like to start with, and that place we come from, is recognizing it's really not our job, and it's completely inappropriate for us to define what rights are and how they get respected. However, we do realize that in that space we occupy and with the relationships we have, we can play a role in supporting different parties who are involved in and around the forest to come together and hopefully work together respectfully to ensure that the inherent and treaty rights that Indigenous peoples hold are respected within the practices that are happening within the ground. That traditional knowledges and self-determined priorities in the forest are respected. And we recognize that one of the best ways to get there, because of the long history and often a very fraught history that exists in and around the forest, is to support relationship building, opportunities for parties, including Indigenous rights holders, to come together, to get to know each other, to build some common ground, hopefully have some common experience, and through that find ways of working together respectfully, productively, and effectively into the future. So one of the ways that we can do that, of course, is through Objective 8 of our forest management standard. And I'm just going to take us on a little tour of what's exactly in there, and then talk about some of the other ways that different folks within the forest sector are using it as a framework or maybe a launching point to advance relationship building and hopefully support greater respect for Indigenous rights holders in the areas that they operate. Really, the first piece and really the foundation of Objective 8 in the standard is having a policy and requiring certified organizations to have a policy that commits to respecting Indigenous people's rights, right? Really starting with that public acknowledgement of that intent, right? What I would say is do the right thing in this case. And then once that policy is in place, take appropriate actions to be able to implement a program that actually brings it to life. One of the new requirements when we updated our standard a couple of years ago, though, was to actually require certified organizations to make that policy publicly available. Many had done this in the past, just as part of that sort of manner of course. But we often would have conversations with Indigenous rights holders to say, like, we know that there is an SFI certified organization operating in our territory, and we know that there are, pieces in your standard that require some form of engagement or relationship. But it's really hard to actually understand where to begin because that information isn't really accessible to us. And we don't often have the starting point of the relationship to even be able to get to it. So it's through feedback and those conversations that, making those updates and revisions to include that really, strong public disclosure of what that intent statement is, right? And that policy to recognize rights and implement that program really became important as that standard became updated a couple of years ago. With that policy in place, we then require through the standard SFI certified organizations to go through, what we sort of have framed out as a respectful rights recognition process. And you'll see this when you go into, objective 8.1 within the standard. And really that process, though it's going to look different in every forest because of the unique geography, unique peoples, unique rights related landscape, really does though still follow the same basic, step-by-step process. The first one, and the first step there that we require and organizations are audited against, is to identify the rights holders, the Indigenous rights holders that are in and around or may have an interest within the area that is being affected by a certified organization's forest management operations. From there, once those rights holding peoples are identified, the certified organization needs to identify what their unique and protected rights are. So this might, lie in things like case law, like treaty rights, like title rights, like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And again, that framework, because of the sheer diversity and complexity across North America, is going to look different in different places, but it is a requirement that certified organizations have that due diligence to start to put that interpretive or that understanding framework in place. And then once those rights holding peoples and the unique rights are understood and identified, it is then incumbent upon that organization to implement a program of tangible actions to ensure that those rights are respected on the ground. With that framework in place, one of the additional requirements to the standard that we included the last time it was revised was to add in a new requirement around training for both personnel and contractors within certified organizations to ensure that they have the understanding and competencies required to ensure that Indigenous people's rights are respected within whatever role they have within that organization. We really wanted to break it out and be very explicit about personnel and contractors because we do realize that the forest sector workforce is diverse. It's sometimes complex, and it is going to look different in different places in terms of its composition. So we really wanted to be explicit with certified organizations that this wasn't just for your employees in-house, but anyone that you have right within your network that has a role, whether it's in a planning office or on the ground in a harvesting operation, understands that their role, potentially intersects with Indigenous people's rights, protected rights, and that they're going to have to therefore have a role in ensuring those rights are respected. And I'll touch a bit more on some of the progress around that a bit later. From there, it really is incumbent on the organization to implement that program of tangible action. And we do have a number of guideposts built right within the standard, both in 8.2 and 8.3, that talk about some of those different pieces that need to be implemented. One of the very first and most important ones is simply through communications. And we were, very careful this time around in the revisions process to specify that that communication needs to occur through Indigenous nations self-determined representative institutions. And that's language directly from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We realize that different, forest policies and regulations, look at communication differently. In some cases, it's fairly robust, and there are provisions for customized consultation protocols, for example. But in others, it just says you can send 3 letters, and if you don't hear anything back, that's good enough. Right. So we really wanted to specify here that it's important to understand what communication works from the perspective of Indigenous right holders. What are those appropriate protocols that should be followed to ensure that this process, this communication that forms the basis of relationships, is a strong one. So these were things that new sort of requirements that were baked into the SFI standard. In addition and beyond that, it is very important that as different management interventions and practices are being contemplated, that the certified organization understands traditional forest-related knowledges, protected or important sites, whether they be culturally or economically important sites for those Indigenous rights holders, and that they are considered within their forest management plans and practices. And similarly, understanding the many different ways that Indigenous rights holders have relationships with the forest, utilize the forest, including through the use of non-timber forest products of value, and ensuring that those are integrated and considered within forest management plans and practices. That leads to sort of the final addition then is it's great to say that all of this is happening, and of course there are audits by qualified auditors to make sure that these things are being implemented. But we also thought it was important to include that requirement around creating space for those Indigenous rights holders to review both forest management plans as well as practices on the ground, and having mechanisms to be able to figure out, again, what is appropriate, what is desired, and being able to put that in place. So again, none of this is about defining what those rights are, because they are going to look different in many different places. But we hope that some of these touch points, right, and these different mechanisms and inroads are going to ensure that within whatever that rights related framework is, there are those meaningful opportunities to have communication, engagement, collaboration, all of which will hopefully lead to respect and rights recognition. So it's in within that it a lot of this comes through relationship, and it can be strengthened through greater relationship. So in addition to our certification standards, the SFI Forest Management Standard, for example, SFI has three other really incredible pillars of work, one of which Lauren leads, our conservation pillar. But we spend a lot of time and a lot of energy investing in creating different programs and services and resources and opportunities where folks in and around the forest, including SFI certified organizations, can come to advance relationships. And this toolkit is being used more and more by the SFI network and certified organizations to help open doors to relationships with Indigenous communities that can then hopefully lead to greater recognition through the standard. So just to touch on a few of those, again, we have four pillars and programs and services throughout those standards, of course, conservation, as well as a really robust community and education team, and of course, communications staff that really support all of our pillars and actually have some really great relationship building opportunities on their own. Standards, and some people don't think about this, but RSFI standards have actually become a really strong resource for organizations to actually build new relationships, in the sense that certified organizations, right, often have a lot of infrastructure that enables them to do sustainable forest management in a good way. And they recognize and they have Indigenous neighbors that, right, are building or maybe leading their own forestry programs, and sometimes looking to grow those forestry programs to take on new opportunities. And third-party forest certification can be a way to open doors within new aspects of supply chains, to support greater continuous improvement, right? To help the communication of different things that forest managers, and including tribal forest managers, are doing that are very positive. So more and more we're seeing existing certified organizations working with Indigenous forest managers in their local area to actually support the building of certification programs within those communities, whether it's through financial support, whether it's through in-kind or technical support, whether it's through opening doors to participate in SFI implementation committees to build other relationship networks that can support like a really large and robust and prosperous landscape level forestry network. So again, while I talked previously about the SFI standard as sort of those objectives, it's also a tool and a program that a lot are actually using to build relationships outside of peer compliance. We also have a number of different granting programs, from community grants to conservation to certification readiness programs that are all accessible and available to tribes, to Indigenous forest managers, that many in our network, including current certified organizations, are actually using to open a door to conversation, to working on something together where they can get to know each other and understand what those appropriate protocols are that we talk about in the standard, and then use that as a launching point to do even more and show even greater respect into the future. SFI, through our education pillar, offers a huge number of different career pathways programs, from green jobs wage matching on the Canadian side, to binational mentorship programs, to youth skills training, to career guides, including one that was actually developed in partnership with Indigenous communities, to an annual scholarship program for students and young professionals at our annual conference, which next year is in Minneapolis. So I think that means most of you are going to be able to attend pretty accessibly. But all of these again are resources and tools that certified organizations have used to open doors or open new doors with some of their tribal partners, or local Indigenous communities who have an interest in the forest. And as many of you know, Project Learning Tree, which is an initiative of SFI, has a massive repertoire of curriculum-aligned environmental education resources that either can be, brought into formal education settings like classrooms, or utilized by certified organizations to support community-based programming, and getting young people especially out into the forest and building those relationships from a young age. So again, we're starting to see more and more uptake from certified organizations using these programs to support relationship building with local Indigenous rights holders. And then through our communications team, we have a really fun and exciting project that we've been working on for about just over a year now, really using our resources and capacity to shine a spotlight on really positive partnerships and relationships that are happening within the forest sector between SFI certified organizations and Indigenous rights holders. We hear all the time through our annual survey, through conversations and other things that, really cool things are happening, innovative things are happening, and practices are being advanced that everyone is feeling really good about, that they think others might be able to learn from. And often though, unfortunately, these get overshadowed in the news by other things, and often negative things. So we've been asked, and we've been really fortunate to partner now with many different nations to create these little spotlights that really show that relationship building is possible. There are mechanisms that can be adapted within your local forest to support rights recognition and relationship building and shared prosperity from the forest. And more, now that they're seeing them, are kind of putting up their hands too to say, we got a cool partnership happening here. Let's share that story as well. So all in all, through that really diverse array, that toolkit of different programs that we hope and we've seen get deployed at the local level to build relationships, we've helped, and supported not only 60 plus Indigenous nations in getting SFI certified themselves, often in partnership with other members of that SFI certified organization network, but also investing in partnerships involving over 180 different Indigenous nations right across North America. And that's through things like our Career Pathways program, grants programs, convening and conference attendance, and all sorts of other things. But again, really trying to use this diverse suite of programs and resources we have, of which the SFI standard that I spoke about earlier is one piece, but use that to just promote a really strong level of respect and relationship throughout the forest involving Indigenous rights holders. And to end, I just wanted to talk a bit more about that new training requirement, because it's one that we've seen a lot of interest from throughout our SFI certified organization network, and one that we feel is one of those lanes that if we as a nonprofit can really invest in that, right, knowledge and understanding, that will really help to trickle out not just through the forest sector, but society as a whole, because we'll be, supporting in, equipping citizens to have a greater understanding for Indigenous peoples and their rights, and hopefully, right, greater respect just within the communities that they live. So we're really proud that we worked with Sault College in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, to create 9 online learning modules all around Indigenous rights recognition and relationship building in the forest sector. We found just through our research there wasn't really anything developed that combined those two things. A lot, right, on rights recognition and relationship building, reconciliation, right, to sort of use a word that's very top of mind in Canada, but none that applied those concepts or found examples from within the forest. So we worked together with the college and a really great Indigenous consulting firm to look at everything from how do you identify the Indigenous rights holders in your area to how do you craft a very thoughtful Indigenous rights recognition policy to how do you support recruitment and retention of Indigenous employees within your workforce. And those are very much available to support greater training. And then just this past year, we worked with our Central Canada SFI Implementation Committee to take those online learning modules and adapt them into really short, one-page field bulletins that are meant to actually be used as like a tailgate talk by a harvester operator or those field crews, and often those contractor networks that have a very important on-the-ground presence but don't have the time to do online learning. So those are actually being used right now, sort of in northwestern Ontario, by some really cool Indigenous joint ventures that exist with the forest sector. So we're constantly getting feedback and are looking for partners actually to expand them and be able to adapt them really to fit the American context, which has a lot of similarities, but also a lot of uniqueness and distinctions.
Thanks, Paul. I will just jump in here and get going. Thanks for queuing that up. I'll be able to kind of breeze through a little bit of the background. So thanks for that. And so to transition everyone, I appreciate Paul kind of queuing up the pillars that we have. So I, again, oversee our conservation pillar. So we're a good sized organization, but we have a lot of really interdisciplinary and collaborative spaces, but we have these pillar structures so that we can tackle key topics, but recognizing that there's all sorts of overlap and interconnections. I did want to frame something that's really interesting about the space that SFI operates in, is that we are at this intersection, some very interesting intersections between private sector, sometimes government targets for climate or for biodiversity, how the private sector interfaces, and then what are the assurances for practices or operations within different private sector actors. But we should also note that we also certify a lot of public land or state land specifically in the United States. And for example, in the Lake States region, public or state forests in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota are also certified to SFI. So there are these kind of interesting private sector government intersections that are really interesting in this very timely and pressing space that we all, I'm sure, are very actively working in to address the kind of co-occurring biodiversity and climate crises. And sorry, Paul, I can't remember if you put up this exact slide, but this is so just to give you a sense of our footprint, we actually have a pretty enormous footprint across the US and Canada, more in Canada, but substantial. So big responsibility, big opportunities, and very actively working to address, and I'll show these enhancements to the standard around climate. And so in some ways, we're enhancing the standard itself in the revisions process, and then we have, which happens 5 to 7 years, and then we have time to really continue to interpret and work with our across our footprint to advance that interpretation. And other times, like the biodiversity, we have had that in the standard, but there's new data, new tools coming out that's available where we can enhance the expectations of what is the information going into decision making. So a couple ways that we can work within the framework of the standard. Uh, and I just wanted to put this up briefly. We had kind of an initial launch of our upcoming theory of change. There's a lot of words on the screen. I don't expect you to read this, but it reiterates this multiple pillar approach that Paul introduced us to. We're focused in on my pillar and my team on this green section, the conservation side. But this is a new theory of change that's being released, and our strategic direction is shaped around this. So our next strategic direction is 5 years, shaped around this theory of change. And this is going to be launched in 2025. So it's very timely to start sharing this with you all. And the final, this is actually not quite the final, but the final will be released shortly here after our upcoming fall board meeting. But I wanted to zoom into the conservation piece just a little bit, and you can see that we have like climate and greater forest health and enhanced climate adaptation mitigation is really built right into our kind of core focal areas now, alongside intersecting areas like fire resilience and some of the other topics that we've worked in for a long time in the forest sector, like water quantity and quality, and species and conservation topics as well. And so Paul had flashed this up. If you're unfamiliar with the standard, it is helpful to, I think, skim through it. We could drop a couple links in the chat as well, just so you can easily find them. But we have the forest management standard. We also have fiber sourcing, which is a standard that applies more to mills and facilities that source from multiple landowners. So not the forest management is for like the large landowners that have their own footprint certified to SFI. Fiber sourcing has different requirements about procuring wood from typically smaller landowners, so family forest owners that themselves aren't certified, and in part because it doesn't make sense for them to financially. They may only be harvesting some portion of their land maybe once in 10 years or even 20 years, and so they want to sell the material, but they're not certified themselves. So there's two standards that are interesting to look at. I'm going to focus on the forest management standard today. And you can see that my focal area that I'll focus on is the climate smart forestry aspect of the standard. And this is a new objective as of the last revision, the 2022 revision. And before I jump into that, I did want to introduce a couple more pieces of the conservation pillar, just so you can understand how we work. We have kind of an emerging strategy that we had a little bit of a soft launch at our annual conference this year in Atlanta, and we'll be kind of firming up and more officially launching this. But firming up what is our strategic interventions for our pillar, and this is the kind of the core part is meeting the needs of certified organizations. So whether that's identifying tools, guidance, training, peer engagement, advancing focal topics like climate. So where are we interpreting literature, identifying best management or management practices and best management practices, and then in turn creating conservation knowledge products. So interpreting for our direct audience, which is the certified organizations that need to interpret, but also more broadly. So whether that's contributing to peer-reviewed literature. And then also in analysis and research organizations. So this is opportunities for us to link our work to some of these external frameworks and be able to communicate the value of for example, the greenhouse gas calculation that could be used and needs to be aligned with state level targets. And how do private sector actors align with some of these public initiatives? So within this framework, we're conceptualizing, we have multiple points of intervention. So if you're unfamiliar with how the certification works, we have this revision process that ultimately created our 2022 standards. And now we're in this intense phase of implementation. So this is identifying what are the metrics and the monitoring approaches to assess success. So if we're putting out conceptually climate smart forestry, well, what does that mean? What's the variation on landscape? We work in a very large landscape, and there's very large landowners, there's medium-sized landowners, different levels of capacity and information available. So we're looking to kind of level the playing field while always pushing for continuous improvement. I'll touch on this shortly, but these are some of our communities that we work with. We have our SFI implementation committees. So these are 35 implementation committees that are really at like the state or provincial level across the US and Canada. It's a requirement to participate in your SFI implementation committee for certified organizations. And this is a really important tool for us to engage with on the ground with the forestry community. So this is actually where logger training occurs. And it's an opportunity that we have where we can really push for this interpretation of science into practice and at scale. So this is where we have a lot of workshops, and we can hear of where are their challenges, where's their limitations. We also, if this isn't clear or known, all of SFI certification is third-party audited. So we don't do any auditing. We use accredited third-party auditors that actually audit the implementation of the standards. But the auditors are another interesting opportunity to learn about where are their gaps, where are their needs in terms of supporting certified orgs in interpreting the standards, where can we be strategic in creating tools or training, or setting expectations of the data that needs to be presented to auditors to meet the standard. So this is a very interesting opportunity. Also, we have an auditors forum. It's very diverse, different organizations that are accredited to actually audit the SFI standards across the US and Canada. And then we also have our own research, our grants and partnerships, and I'll cover a bit of that today. I'm going to move a little quickly through the next couple slides, but I just want to emphasize that we do have a grant making capabilities. We've had now over 75 grants with over 5 million of our own dollars that have been distributed for conservation grants. So definitely open to discussions and collaborations. Very important for us to advance the interpretation of the standards with the grants. So has to be linked to the standards, to some of our focal topics, but this is a great opportunity that we have to work with many wonderful partners on the landscape that's doing different types of work in academia, nonprofits, and they can partner with certified organizations. So it's a kind of a concrete way that we can make sure that some of the conversations and dialogues or gaps that we see are getting addressed. Just to mention a couple of interesting examples, we have a couple of collaborations around environmental DNA, for example. So we have 2 projects currently that are advancing. One is in the Southeast, one's in the Pacific Northwest, that's using eDNA samples as a way to assess like riparian health in forested areas and post-fire recovery in the Pacific Northwest, for example. And there's nice collaborations to look at how to use emerging technology to answer conservation challenges in ways that are cost effective and can make sense for large scale landowners that are assessing large footprints. And then I'm going to now talk more about climate smart forestry specifically, but I wanted to give you a taste of some of the other things we work on. Here to kind of get into the details of the standard. This is to bring into focus for you the enhancements to the standard. We had previously there were mentions of climate change within the standard, but this evolved into its own objective. And this is focused now on 2 performance measures that are addressing both adaptation and mitigation. So won't read all of these slides, but really the core of the objectives is pretty high level initially, but it is a requirement for all certified orgs now that they have to have demonstrable efforts to address adaptation and mitigation. So performance measure 9.1 is that they identify and address risks to forests and forest operations, and then they develop appropriate adaptation objectives and strategies. And then 9.2 is that they individually or through cooperative efforts, perhaps with their SICs, those implementation committees, identify and address opportunities to mitigate effects associated with their operations on climate change. So pretty powerful to get the language in the standard, and it gives us a lot to work on to interpret this and to learn about what are certified organizations doing, how can, again, we help level out the playing field, what are auditors seeing, what more support can we provide to move this forward in continual improvement. You all, I'm sure, work on this a lot, but it has been an interesting transition for me to shift to SFI from MSU, where we talked about these strategies and understanding that different actors were involved in different components of this. And it's really interesting at SFI because we we do very actively engage in all of these strategies. And so this is something, the kind of framing that we used previously at MSU and with NIACS in the past, but I'm bringing this forward now in our communications with certified organizations, how they can start really conceptualizing their opportunities and responsibilities in terms of this concept of climate smart forestry, or climate informed forestry, as Chris Swanson would want me to say. One of the things that I'll flag for you briefly is that we're developing indicators and best management practices. So there's some internal discussion of where these should land, but trying to interpret, and again, leveraging a lot of the great work that like NIACS and partners have done, but interpret this in the right level and framing that's appropriate for large scale landowners that are really certified to SFI. So what are some of the major topics? And then how can we make sure that the key ideas are laid out for them in approachable ways? And then we can focus on recommendations to meet those best management practices. And you'll see here that we have front and center Indigenous knowledges. So it's not only we don't see these as separated topics in many ways, that there's a lot of overlap and intersection. But, and we also have another part of the standard, which is on fire resilience, but we of course know that fire, especially with the recent years in Canada and in the US, that fire resilience is directly connected to climate adaptation and resilience as well. So there's definitely a lot of intersections in the standard, and we do try to call that out explicitly when we can. I wanted to flag a project that we currently have underway. So as I mentioned, I was previously at MSU, and so there was a natural opportunity to continue some work that had been ongoing, and had worked closely with different team members from NIACS as well, to look at how can we at SFI kind of bring forward a consistent way of talking about climate smart forestry, where we had all these deep partnerships and relationships in the United States, but we have to expand this on the Canadian footprint as well. And so we have an effort coming out, or a report, and hoping to engage the NIACS team even more on this before we even kind of continue to move forward. But bringing forward all the great work, but trying to boost this like kind of consistent and even cross-border dialogue that allows us to talk really consistently about what do we mean by mitigation and adaptation practices across North America, really. I mean, outside of Mexico, where we don't have certified land ourselves. And so we've worked through our implementation committees. In the past, there's been 7 workshops in 2022 to 2023 on climate smart forestry. I could tell you right now, one of the big takeaways was that people were getting pretty comfortable talking about adaptation, but not as much mitigation yet in our footprint. So we're identifying just some kind of low-hanging fruit opportunities to advance. So people were more keen to talk about widening culverts, or how do we address fire risk, but understanding how to sustain or increase carbon on the landscape was not necessarily the comfort area yet. So as you can guess, there's also a lot of variation for other like cultural and political reasons across the landscape. So we're really looking at engaging and partnering with our science community and our government partners as well. So in the Canadian Forest Service and the US Forest Service, to engage in really science forward way on these topics. And again, kind of like even out some of the places, the discussion, kind of bring up some areas where people haven't been engaging so much in adaptation and mitigation discussions, whereas we know there's been quite a bit in the Lake States and the Northeast, for example. So we have kind of identified some areas for action, which is not all new. This is really growing a lot from NIACS way of approaching things. But assessment of threats and vulnerabilities, identifying your strategies, and moving into suitable approaches and tactics. The main goal of this slide is just to identify that there's some different inputs of information in the US and Canada. So in the US, there's a lot of really well-developed resources, so NIACS adaptation menus. There's really great professionals, lots of pilot projects and resources, places that we're familiar with, whereas in the Canadian context, there is actually a lot of great work as well. Some of it's just maybe more distributed, and some of it's new, honestly, for some of myself and some of our other team members. So it's been a bit of a kind of building a network and enhancing our understanding of the best points of intervention there as well. And then here is one of the kind of concepts that we're presenting and exploring so that we can speak consistently about climate smart forestry is when we look at across North America, we're expanding on a previous collaboration with MSU and NIACS where we created, we actually have training, so short courses in 3 regions of the US. And we're expanding that into the Canadian context. But so starting at your region, how can you say, okay, well, I'm in this region. What are the appropriate subregions of ecological importance? Within that, your key forest community types, any additional delineations based on site or species specific concerns. And then from there, what is the threat? So whether it's geographic or a species specific threat or concern. And then adopting and moving into this NIACS structure of moving from strategies into a specific tactic. So kind of starting to bring a little bit more of a structured way of moving into decision making. So this moving from the science space, which again, NIACS has shown tons of leadership and expertise in, and we're trying to bring this forward in partnership with key actors that we've been working with for a long time, including NIACS and MSU and other university partners. And bring this into like a more of a structured decision making because we've noticed that that's one of the key gap areas. So we've been kind of experimenting with what this looks like with some different key species or concerns. So there's been some kind of experimenting with building out some different types of like matrices to say like if you had a decision support tool, what could that look like? Or if we had different scenarios, what could this look like? And so this is just kind of an example where we're going from like the lake states, looking at like regeneration issues and what a tactic could be, which could be interplant or supplement with natural regeneration. And then maybe this one's a better example. So it's a little less busy, but we wanted to get a sense of how we were experimenting because you have all of these options once you start building it out. But here's an example from the lake states in the Northeast. And if you have a concern like something like oak wilt, how would you go from looking at your region and where you're at? What are you looking at in terms of your forest type? Any specific threats or concerns into a strategy that ends up as a tactic. So trying with experimenting with gaps in silvicultural prescriptions that can create uneven age conditions in the future. So this is a bit, this is kind of moving into like firming up our conceptual approaches. And then we have various paths to bring that on the ground and to experiment. So leveraging ongoing work from certified organizations, large scale landowners, and thinking about what's the right approaches in terms of workshopping to test out some of these and to find what works on the ground. So we have a major project that we are in the final stages on in Canada. And so this is with the Environment Climate Change Canada. We were awarded a pretty sizable grant to advance climate smart forestry. And so this is really looking at their framing is on around a sector-based approach, working with large-scale industrial organizations, which are super important in the Canadian context as well. They're really large-scale decision makers. And the key activities here are really kind of similar to this kind of conceptual thinking that I've been sharing. So this prioritizing and interpreting risk and opportunity, moving into BMPs, workshopping these. One of the key aspects here I did want to highlight is the key part of this project is it has a major flow through component to our Indigenous partners. So we will be funding some activities and interventions on the ground, but that funding will be really elevating and focusing on our Indigenous partners there. And so actually some of the organizations that Paul had mentioned, and very grateful to Paul for his leadership and his support on guiding this aspect of the project. But again, we do see Indigenous knowledges and partners as actually cross-cutting. So it's not only in that strategy, but it is a really kind of key part of it. And then so my last slide is next steps for US work is we're looking at advancing on a parallel effort to the Canadian project in the US. So looking at kind of a scaled, structured approach where we're not the experts on all the things, but we do have a unique way to engage with large-scale decision makers on the landscape and actually have a requirement for them to do so in some ways built into the standard. So we have a kind of an interesting tool that we can leverage. We want to elevate existing research pilots and practices. So we're not, again, looking to recreate the wheel. We would love to maybe explore working with you all on how to elevate work that you're doing that you think is important, or things that you know would like to see brought forward, and love to find ways to work with you. And one of the key unique nuances that I've talked with Maria and Stephen about that we'd like to really lean into is interpreting the practices and the outputs for large scale landowners. And to kind of articulate when are there differences in terms of values or goals or resources or capacity for large scale landowners versus smaller scale landowners, and what needs to happen in terms of grants or support to get those get the practices on the ground for different types of landowners. So we're looking to secure resources to support piloting and more on the ground implementation, and measuring and assessing those barriers and opportunities. And then, of course, strengthen collaborations and relationships, and including with all of you all. So thanks. I really appreciate it. And there's my contact information, and look forward to a little discussion.